O Lord, in all our doings with thy most gracious favor, and further us with thy continued help, that on all our works begun, continued, and ended in thee, we may glorify thy holy name, and finally, by thy mercy, attain everlasting life. Amen. Presenting petitions. I recognize the member from Saskatoon Fairview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my pleasure to rise today to present a petition to the Government of Saskatchewan regarding Hemlibra coverage. These citizens wish to bring to our attention that the Canadian Agency for Drugs and Technologies in Health, CTS, released its recommendation to the provinces and territories regarding Hemlibra to prevent bleeding in people with hemophilia A without factor VIII inhibitors. That CTS recommendation that the cost of Hemlibra be reimbursed by Canadian Blood Services means access would be conditional on unreasonable pricing constraints, risking that most with hemophilia A will not get this life-changing treatment. That at present time, most hemophilia A patients are using factor VIII replacement therapies that are not as effective as Hemlibra for reducing number of bleeds annually, and that Hemlibra coverage would reduce costs to the provincial government in terms of hospitalizations, human resources, and supplies, and that Hemlibra has been introduced in a cost-effective manner in other jurisdictions and can be done in Canada as well. I'd like to read the prayer. We, in the prayer that reads as follows, respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan call on the Minister of Health to work with the federal government to seek rapid approval of Hemlibra so that all people with severe hemophilia A can have access to this therapy immediately. This is signed by individuals from Viscount and Saskatoon. I do so present.
I recognize the member from Saskatoon University.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm happy to once again present a petition calling for pay equity legislation in Saskatchewan. The signatories here would like to bring the following to our attention. Saskatchewan is one of only 4 provinces that does not have pay equity legislation. Saskatchewan has one of the highest gender wage gaps in Canada, which is the result of systemic gender discrimination in compensation for work that must be corrected with pay equity legislation. The Saskatchewan Human Rights Commission has recommended proactive and comprehensive pay equity legislation, which has not been pursued by the Government of Saskatchewan. While the Saskatchewan Human Rights Code prohibits gender-based compensation discrimination, the complaint-driven process puts no positive obligation on employers. That while pay equity advocacy primarily seeks to address gender-based wage discrimination, it must also be mindful of ability, age, identity, and race-based wage discrimination. I'll read the prayer. We, in the prayer that reads as follows, respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan call on the Government of Saskatchewan to introduce pay equity legislation. Our petition today has been signed by people from Regina, Mr. Speaker. I so move.
I recognize the member from Regina Alphastone Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is my pleasure to rise and present a petition to save the Lighthouse and provide core funding to emergency homeless shelters across the province. I have risen to present this petition now a number of times. It's a petition that calls for core funding. Right now across the province, shelters are funded by occupancy, meaning they only get funded per eligible occupant per night. This makes long-term planning nearly impossible. Significant jurisdictional issues arise when someone from a First Nations community stays the night. They struggle to get funding for that bed. The Lighthouse and the Battlefords may close if this government doesn't step in. And I had the pleasure of meeting the folks that used the shelter back in March, including Claudia Turner, who has signed this petition. She told me her story, Mr. Speaker. She'd fallen on hard times. She'd sobered up at the Lighthouse for the Battlefords. She was connected with help and programming. She found a sympathetic and supportive community there, and she's sober to this day, working, thriving. This is the only general shelter in the area, Mr. Speaker. They serve overflow every single night. I saw the cots that they drag into the recreational area. They do that every single night. And it would require between $600,000 and $800,000 to fund the shelter. And just to put that in some perspective, this government announced $4 million additional funding for hockey. So it can be done if we make it a priority. So kudos to the signatories of this petition, Mr. Speaker, calling for change just as people face increased challenges across this province. I hope those calls don't continue to fall on deaf ears. And with that, I will read the prayer as follows. The signatories call on the Government of Saskatchewan to immediately provide staple, guaranteed, core funding to the lighthouse serving the Battlefords, and to expand supports for emergency shelters across Saskatchewan by moving to a core funding model. The signatories of this petition are from North Battleford. Mr. Speaker, thank you. I do so present.
Statement by members. I recognize the member from Regina Lakeview.
Mr. Speaker, this weekend, Prince Albert lost one of its most treasured citizens. Victor Thunderchild became ill with COVID-19 a few weeks ago while at work, and sadly, he did not survive this battle. Victor was a teacher and counselor at Carleton Comprehensive High School for 29 years. There and through his involvement in the community, he became a leader and mentor for many of the students that he taught. Victor taught young Indigenous students about their culture and to have pride in it. But just as importantly, Victor was eager to share his culture with non-Indigenous people so that everyone would have a better understanding and appreciation. Victor was truly a bridge builder and a community pillar, and he touched so many lives. Thousands of people have come together to show solidarity and pay tribute through stories and memories. The Apples for Victor initiative is sweeping across social media and the windows of homes and businesses as a symbol of mourning and respect. Victor's wife, Violet, has noted that many of the nurses who tried so valiantly to save Victor in his final hours were former students. Victor was an extraordinary educator, and he will be terribly missed. Mr. Speaker, I ask that all members join with me in extending our deepest sympathy to the family of Victor Thunderchild and to all those he has touched during the time that this province was lucky enough to have him.
I recognize the member from Cut Knife Turtleford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Tammy Longer, owner of the Hollyhocks business in Unity, has been named the new president of the Saskatchewan Greenhouse Growers Association. Mr. Speaker, Mrs. Longer indicated that the Saskatchewan Greenhouse Growers Association was instrumental in greenhouses being able to open during this past growing season. Greenhouses are considered an essential service in the province because they help supply people with seeds and starter bedding plants to grow their own vegetables at home. Mr. Speaker, Mrs. Longer mentions that growing gardens, flowers, and plants by her customers contributed to stress reduction and positive mental health. There are more than 100 greenhouses in Saskatchewan that are part of the association. The association, Mr. Speaker, has been providing information to greenhouse owners about how to sell products from their virtual stores and establish a presence on the internet. Greenhouses are continuing to see more sales online as more people are taking up gardening. Mrs. Longer and Hollyhocks Greenhouse have been commended for their community booster efforts for a variety of fundraisers and charities, further demonstrating her commitment to giving back to the community of Unity. Mr. Speaker, I would now ask all members of this Assembly to join me in congratulating Mrs. Longer on her appointment to President of the Saskatchewan Greenhouse Growers Association. Thank you.
Recognize the member from Regina University.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to recognize Infertility Awareness Week. Infertility knows no boundaries and impacts all communities. 1 in 6 people will be impacted by infertility, and that includes thousands here in Saskatchewan. Unfortunately, while Saskatchewan will cover the cost of preliminary fertility investigations, it does not cover the cost of treatment, and treatments can cost tens of thousands of dollars. For those who can scrimp and save and put this money towards creating a family, many more will have to travel out of province for services not available here in Saskatchewan, and all have to live with the knowledge that each cycle is costly, invasive, painful, and may not have the outcome that they hope and pray for. Mr. Speaker, we place value on children and we place value on families, and we should not prevent people from having a family because they don't have the money. Childlessness should be a choice, not a sentence. And in an era where such miraculous technology is available, how can this government stand idly by while so many live with anguish? To mark Infertility Awareness Week, I call on this government to work to eliminate financial barriers and examine what is done in other provinces across Canada to expand access to infertility treatments.
Recognize the member from Martensville-Warman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 3-year-old Grayson Griswold has 2 passions: skateboarding and keeping the earth clean. Each time he heads to the Warman skateboard park on his bike, Grayson makes sure to spend time picking up any garbage that has been left over from the big kids the night before. He also looks out for his fellow bikers and skateboarders as well, making sure the paths are clear for them all to safely enjoy. Mr. Speaker, Grayson's good deeds are being recognized, as a photo of him cleaning up the park on social media caught the attention of his community. His community has been reaching out to Grayson and rewarding him for being such a great role model and for the younger and older kids in his neighbourhood. Even the mayor, Gary Philipchuk, has thanked Grayson for his efforts, as he recognizes how important it is for all of us to follow Grayson's example and step up and take care of our communities. Mr. Speaker, small acts of service can have such a huge impact on a city, and I think we can all learn a valuable lesson from young Grayson. I now ask all members to join me in thanking Grayson Griswold for his acts of generosity. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to rise in the Assembly to recognize an incredible young constituent of mine, Sophie Pollock. Though just 10 years old, Sophie has made hundreds of keychains that she sells to raise money for the Huntington's Society of Canada. Huntington's is a rare and fatal, hereditary, neurodegenerative disease that causes a progressive breakdown of the nerve cells in the brain. Both Sophie's great-grandmother and great-uncle had Huntington's. Mr. Speaker, each keychain that Sophie designs and makes has an encouraging word, as well as a dragonfly pendant, which to the HD community symbolizes hope. Sophie has shipped keychains all across Canada, from British Columbia to Newfoundland and Labrador, and even into the United States. And to date, she has made over 500 keychains and has raised $6,460.71. And Mr. Speaker, an anonymous donor within the Huntington Society of Canada has matched her dollar for a total of $12,921.42. Mr. Speaker, I'd ask all members to join with me in congratulating Sophie Pollock on her outstanding contributions in the fight against Huntington's disease. Thank you.
Recognize the member from Saskatchewan Rivers.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Our government today announced various supports for commercial outfitters and ecotourism operations here in Saskatchewan. This industry, Mr. Speaker, has been especially hit hard due to the global pandemic, and offering supports aligns with the steps our government is taking to assist industries with immediate financial relief during these challenging times. The industry has seen great losses in revenue due to cancellations and reduced demand, so it is our hope that this immediate relief can help them get back on their feet. The interim assistance measures include forsaking outfitting license fees for those who do not operate in 2021, allowing outfitters to retain the right to a license in 2022, as well as maintaining the ability to advertise for the 2022 season, reducing fees for those who do decide to operate this year to $20 for each license, endorsement, day use lake fee, and outcamp fee, and setting 21-22 disposition rates for $0 for outfitters and ecotourism operators with Crown Resource land permits or leases. Our world slowly and responsibly returns to normal. We will be relying on our commercial outfitters and ecotourism operators to help with our economic recovery. Please join me in thanking all outfitters and ecotourism operations for their contribution to our economy and service to Saskatchewan. Thank you.
Recognize the Minister of Advanced Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Saskatchewan people continue to stick it to COVID faster than any other province in Canada. Our healthcare workers have now administered over 350,000 vaccine shots. Nearly 3/4 of all Saskatchewan residents 60 and older, more than half of Saskatchewan people 40 and older, and 1/3 of all eligible adults in our province have now received at least their first shot. I was fortunate to have one of those 350,000 shots go into my arm last week, and I want to thank all the staff working at the Regina drive-through clinics and all the other vaccine clinics right across Saskatchewan. They are doing a tremendous job. They'd be getting even more people vaccinated faster if we had received more vaccines. Mr. Speaker, vaccines work. Countries that are further along than Canada are seeing significant reductions in their case numbers and hospitalization numbers. And I'm sure that'll happen here too as more and more people get vaccinated. So once again, thanks to everyone working in the vaccine clinics. They're doing a great job. And to everyone who've taken the time to go to a clinic and get vaccinated. Every shot in every arm makes Saskatchewan just a little bit safer. So when it's your turn, please roll up your sleeve and stick it to COVID. Thank you.
Question period. I recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On March 9th, despite knowing that the province was facing a surge of more dangerous and more contagious variants, the Premier chose to relax public health restrictions. That reckless decision, since the time of that reckless decision, over 60 more Saskatchewan people have lost their lives due to COVID-19. One of those people is Vic Thunderchild from Prince Albert, a leader, a teacher, a friend to so many. He passed away due to COVID-19 this past weekend. 2 weeks ago, Mr. Thunderchild tweeted, and I quote, "Thank you, Premier Scott Moe, for not thinking we're essential workers as I sit in the Vic Hospital recovering from COVID-19. Get my fellow teachers vaccinated before this happens to anyone else." Well, tragically, he didn't recover, and those teachers still haven't been vaccinated. Mr. Speaker, will this finally be enough? Will the Premier finally listen and finally prioritize teachers so that we can safely keep schools open and protect those working so hard to support Saskatchewan children?
Recognize the Premier.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. First and foremost, I'd like to take the opportunity to offer Mr. Thunderchild's family, his friends, and all of his colleagues, Mr. Speaker, our most sincere condolences and my most sincere condolences. As many know, I live in the Prince Albert area in that region, and I have heard many stories about Mr. Thunderchild, Mr. Speaker, over the course of the last years, and seen him in some of the activities that he would volunteer with our youth in the area, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I would just say I've also seen a number of very passionate stories online and in the community, heard from friends, Mr. Speaker, mutual friends that we have. And I offer my condolences to the family and colleagues. Mr. Speaker, we have prioritized throughout this pandemic those that are over the age of 40, as they have the most severe outcomes when they do contract COVID-19. 84% of our hospitalizations are folks over 40. 96% of our fatalities are folks over 40, Mr. Speaker. In the days ahead, as we approach that 40 age group, Mr. Speaker, given those statistics, it does provide an opportunity for us to have a conversation around should we be providing those vaccines to folks that are at a higher risk of contracting COVID, Mr. Speaker, understanding that we have addressed the primary risk, which is those that have severe outcomes when they do contract COVID.
Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The question was clear. Will the teachers get vaccinated? How many stories like this does it take? How many people have to lose their lives before the Premier will listen? But sadly, Vic Thunderchild's tragic story is one of far too many in this province. 465 people have lost their lives. 465 families are mourning a loved one, and we don't know how many more yet to come, Mr. Speaker, and it didn't have to be this way. But every step along the way, this Premier ignored the signs, ignored the science, and took us down the wrong road. Schools are still closed here in our capital city because this Premier failed to take the action to keep them safe. School boards are speaking up for teachers. Vic Thunderchild spoke up for teachers. The Premier refused to listen. Will he listen now? Will the Premier finally take action and get our teachers vaccinated?
Recognize the Premier.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. This is precisely why we have the significant measures in place across the province that we do have in place, and we continue to ask people to follow those measures. This is why, Mr. Speaker, these severe outcomes, the 465 fatalities, Mr. Speaker, is why we have prioritized by age down to the age of 40, all of those folks across the province. The answer was clear in the last answer, Mr. Speaker. Over 40, 84% of the people that we have had in hospital are over the age of 40. 96% of our fatalities are over the age of 40. As we approach that 40-year age group, Mr. Speaker, we are actively having a conversation with public health. Should we now shift our priority? Should we shift our priority to those folks in this province that, understanding we've addressed those folks that are most likely to have severe outcomes in the age groups over 40, should we now, with those age groups under 40, shift our focus to those folks that might be at highest risk of contracting COVID, Mr. Speaker? Those are active discussions. I think I'll have more to say over the course of the next day or two.
Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We have the worst hospitalization rates in the entire country, the worst level of ICU admissions in the entire country, worse than Ontario. Ontario that's reaching out and asking for extra help, while this Premier says everything's fine, while this Health Minister says our ICUs are doing just fine. Our healthcare professionals are frustrated. They don't even know how many alarm bells they're going to have to ring to get this Premier to listen. It's easy to make decisions from an ivory tower when you have no idea what's happening on the front lines, Mr. Speaker. That's why today I'm calling on the Premier. Let's go find out. Let's put on that PPE. Let's go tour our struggling ICUs together. Will the Premier join me in visiting ICU here in Regina?
Recognize the Premier.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, with respect to visiting one of our ICUs here in the province, Mr. Speaker, that wouldn't be appropriate at this point in time, so there's no plans to do that, Mr. Speaker. In saying that, we understand that we have ICU staff that are working extremely hard across this province, hospital staff that are working extremely hard across this province. We do have hospitalization numbers are higher, yes, and we would like to see them. Mr. Speaker, that is why we have put in place significant measures across the province, more significant measures right here in the city of Regina due to the concentration of variants that we've had here, due in part to ensure that we can stem those hospitalization rates here in Regina. It's also why we have been very focused on ensuring that we are providing as many vaccines as we can to Saskatchewan people. We're leading the nation in a very robust vaccine rollout, Mr. Speaker. Saskatchewan is leading all Canadian provinces in getting those vaccines into the arms of our residents and making them available inside the province. We see Regina leading Saskatchewan in providing those vaccines to Regina people in the area, in and around, or in Regina and the surrounding area. Mr. Speaker, we most certainly are going to continue to work with all of those across the public health care system and encourage those folks in Regina and across the province to continue to follow the public health measures that are in place. And when it's your opportunity and when your opportunity comes up, stick it to COVID. Let's go get our shots.
Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It would be not only appropriate, but very welcome by the frontline staff if we were to come and visit. In fact, I spoke this morning with Dr. Jeff Betcher. He's the lead intensivist. He's the head of Regina's ICU. And he's on service this week. And he offered to personally take me and the Premier on a tour and see exactly what's going on in Regina's ICUs so that we understand the dire situation that he and his team are facing. We're already double bunking COVID patients in Regina's ICU. They didn't want us to know about that, but it's happening. And in Saskatoon, we're headed down the same road where they're already having to admit adult patients into the pediatric intensive care unit. Mr. Speaker, this is a nightmare scenario, and it's a nightmare that this Premier needs to see with his own two eyes. When we're facing a crisis, when we're facing a disaster, true leaders show up. Mr. Premier, so once again, will the Premier commit to joining me? Let's go. Let's put on the PPE. Let's go visit the ICU. Let's understand exactly what's going on in our hospitals today.
Recognize the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, as I said, our hospitalization rate in this province is higher than what we would like to see it. Our ICU rate as well is higher than what we would like to see it, in particular here in our hospitals in Regina. Mr. Speaker, in saying that, we're down a couple ICUs in the province from yesterday relative to today. Mr. Speaker, that's a good thing. Mr. Speaker, and we continue to encourage Saskatchewan people to follow all the public health measures that are in place. That is what will keep us safe until such time that we can provide vaccines to everyone in this province. Mr. Speaker, of which we are doing at a very accelerated rate. Up until now, Mr. Speaker, we have about 33% of people over the age of 18 in Saskatchewan have received their vaccine. That's a nation-leading percentage point, Mr. Speaker. However, over the course of the next week or two, we are having a reduced number of vaccines available with the Moderna shipment that has been delayed and now cut in half. Mr. Speaker, we're receiving about 31,000 doses of Pfizer this week. Mr. Speaker, that's enough for just less than 3 days with the current capacity that we have, never mind when we bring on our pharmaceutical capacity. Mr. Speaker, we're going to continue to focus Saskatchewan people on public health measures and ensuring that it's when their opportunity that they're out making their appointment, getting their vaccination to ensure that we can all stay safe.
Recognize the member from Regina Lakeview.
Last week, I called on the minister to respond to the letters from the boards of Regina Public, Regina Catholic, and Prairie Valley School Divisions. I asked on Friday if he would make sure that school staff can get vaccinated as soon as possible. That very same day, the chairs of Saskatoon's public and Catholic boards, along with the chair of Prairie Spirit, added their voices to the call to prioritize school staff in the vaccine rollout. Hear, hear. Their public letters noted that education is key to the recovery and revitalization of Saskatchewan. This side of the House certainly agrees, Mr. Speaker. Education is important, and safe schools are important. Will the minister recognize the importance of this call, and will he get teachers and school staff vaccinated now?
Recognize the Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, and first I want to join with the Premier and other members that have to express my condolences to the family of Mr. Thunderchild, all of his family and colleagues at Carleton High School in Prince Albert, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as the Premier has indicated, what we want to do is focus on ensuring that those that are most vulnerable to severe outcomes have a vaccination, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we've made significant progress on that, and as the Premier has indicated, as we get closer to that 40 age threshold, Mr. Speaker, that's going to allow us to look at some additional options when it comes to prioritizing other groups, Mr. Speaker. But I want to be clear and make sure that this is on the record, Mr. Speaker, that teachers and education staff are already eligible based on that age group, Mr. Speaker. In fact, here in Regina, approximately 40% of education staff are eligible for a vaccine. So I don't want to leave any impression that somehow teachers and educators and educational assistants aren't eligible, Mr. Speaker. In fact, 40% are, and there's no reason why 40% aren't already vaccinated.
Recognize the member from Regina Lakeview.
Mr. Speaker, I think that the boards representing 60% of the student population in this province understand what they're asking for. On Friday, the minister had some interesting words in response that I'd like to read into the record. He said, quote, "There's no evidence of large chain transmission within our school system." Mr. Speaker, the SHA's numbers note that last week in Regina, 261 active cases were in children and youth. Further, the test positivity rate for children and youth in Regina was 17.6%. It's fair to say that between those case numbers and test positive rates in the stratosphere, variants of concern are in our schools. Ensuring school staff are healthy keeps schools open, which also allows parents to get back to work. It's not rocket science, it's also good for the economy. Will the minister change his mind and get teachers and school staff vaccinated?
Recognize the Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Well, we are working to get teachers and educational assistants and other people in the education sector vaccinated, Mr. Speaker. That's why today in the City of Regina, 40% have already been eligible, Mr. Speaker, and I would hope that that 40% are eligible by the fact that they've taken advantage of that eligibility, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the SHA information as it relates to contact tracing does indicate that school exposures have resulted in the smallest proportion of contacts that then go on to become a positive case, Mr. Speaker. So there is evidence that large-scale in-school transmission has not been the case over the last year in Saskatchewan, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I would certainly encourage, as I have done to the chair of the Regina Public School Division, as I have done to other leaders in the education sector, that while we are waiting for the ability to vaccinate those that are most at risk for severe outcomes, in the meantime, I urge them to urge their employees to get vaccinated when they can.
Recognize the member from Regina Lakeview.
Mr. Speaker, while that minister waits, more and more children are sitting at home because it's not safe for them to be in the classroom. The minister mused Friday that 60% of education staff in Regina will be able to get their vaccine through the drive-through in perhaps less than a week. While I appreciate his optimism, perhaps the Minister of Health might remind him that as of yesterday, the Regina drive-through clinic is closed for 2 weeks. It's great that people are getting vaccinated and that demand is high. What's not so great is that the promise the minister made to education staff on Friday was rendered null and void by Sunday. So again, instead of kicking the can down the road, will the minister give us a real solution and allow teachers and school staff to book a vaccine appointment today?
Recognize the Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, I think the premise of the member's question kind of explains the answer. There are no vaccines available, Mr. Speaker. The supply is insufficient, Mr. Speaker, to vaccinate those that are most at risk of extreme outcomes, Mr. Speaker. The supply is insufficient to even carve out any other groups, Mr. Speaker. We need to focus on those that are most at risk of extreme outcomes, Mr. Speaker. That is the 40 and over age groups, Mr. Speaker. We want to vaccinate teachers. We want to vaccinate educational assistants, Mr. Speaker, and we can only do so when the federal government gets us the supply of vaccines that we need.
Recognize the member from Saskatoon Fairview.
Well, Mr. Speaker, that's a convenient excuse this week. Mr. Speaker, this government has had plenty of data reporting issues throughout this pandemic. Just last month, we learned that the SHA was underreporting dozens of hospital and intensive care patients. And based on the minister's comments last week, we still aren't getting the full picture. Can the minister tell us how many hospital and ICU beds are currently filled with patients who are hospitalized with COVID but have been deemed recovered?
Recognize the Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I did speak in error on committee last week, Mr. Speaker. If they are in the hospital or they have tested positive, no matter how long they remain in that hospitalization within our hospital, they will still be counted as that. So that's my apologies. I do have a letter that I'm going to submit to the Chair of Human Services Committee and prepared to table it here today, Mr. Speaker. But getting to the larger fact here, Mr. Speaker, which the Premier and the Minister of Education have alluded to, we can get to all of these people out there, Mr. Speaker. We have had shipments after shipments after shipments delayed, cut in half of our vaccines. We have had to reprioritize over 30,000 bookings, Mr. Speaker. We've had to continually adjust, and I want to again put this on the record, thanking the frontline healthcare workers who have to drop a shift, pick up a shift very quickly, Mr. Speaker, because of the inconsistency of our supply, Mr. Speaker. We're only getting 31,000. Now, it sounds like a big number, Mr. Speaker, but as the Premier alluded, that gives us roughly 2.5 days to 3 days of vaccination. Mr. Speaker, we haven't even tapped into our potential of what we could do in this province if we could get the vaccine supply. Mr. Speaker, I call on them to talk to their federal leader to be able to put these questions to the Prime Minister of When are we going to get our vaccines here in Saskatchewan, Mr. Speaker?
Recognize the member from Saskatoon Fairview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd ask the minister to respond to the question that's being asked as well. Just days ago in committee, the minister said that after 10 days, a COVID-19 patient is deemed recovered and is no longer included in reported COVID data. Based on what the minister said in committee, it would seem that hospital and ICU numbers being reported daily wouldn't include people in hospital as a result of COVID after 10 days, regardless of their current medical conditions. Now we're hearing the exact opposite from the SHA and from that minister today. Was this always the case? Was this always the way that the numbers were reported, or was this change made over the weekend and was the source of this weekend's data delays?
Recognize the Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, it continues to amaze me when they write 3 questions that they can't actually pivot up there when I answer the first question on the first go-around. They ask the same question again because they've got it written down, because they can't do an audible on the spot, Mr. Speaker, and ask a really legitimate question. What the legitimate question should be, Mr. Speaker, is how come Saskatchewan is leading our country? How come we are able to continue to lead our country in vaccinations, Mr. Speaker? Why? Because we have a great system that starts at the SHA and the ministry and works all the way down to the people that are at our drive-thrus, our walk-in clinics, and Mr. Speaker, and our mass vaccination clinics. We have the best running system in the country, Mr. Speaker, booking out people all across this province in all different locations and all different mechanisms of being able to deliver those vaccines. Mr. Speaker, I am very proud of what we've done here in Saskatchewan. We are leading the country in vaccinations, Mr. Speaker, and we will continue to do that, and we will get to that magic number of the age of 40 as soon as we possibly can, Mr. Speaker. But the one thing I can keep harking on, Mr. Speaker, is we need more vaccines in this province so we can get them into people's arms so we can move past this, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
Recognize the member from Saskatoon Fairview.
And what they don't mention at the same time, Mr. Speaker, is how we're leading the country in hospitalizations and in ICU numbers. How is it that we are 13 months into this pandemic and this keeps happening? When will this minister get a grip on his file? In committee, the minister also suggested that those who lose their battle to COVID-19 after day 10 are not counted in COVID death rates. Can the minister confirm that these deaths are currently being accounted for, or will the data be delayed weeks and months until after a coroner investigates? And could this be contributing to the shocking number of excess deaths reported over the last year?
Recognize the Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I do recall that question that was asked me in committee last week, and that was a study out of the UOT that was brought up in question period, Mr. Speaker, about how we are recording. Mr. Speaker, every doctor who does a certificate of death, and I'm sure the Leader of the Opposition maybe unfortunately had to do this sometime, Mr. Speaker, as all doctors do, they fill out that certificate of death with extreme accuracy, Mr. Speaker. That is because it is very important to have closure for the family, and that if there are extenuating circumstances, like with any death, Mr. Speaker, there is the coroner that gets involved. There is pathology that is done to make sure that the certificate of death is accurate, Mr. Speaker. To be able to say that the doctors aren't doing their job, Mr. Speaker, is just completely inaccurate.
Recognize the member from Regina University.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Hiding behind death certificates, really brave. You know, Mr. Speaker, the members opposite, they won't tour hospitals, they won't tour schools. Whether this is a failure of leadership or a failure of courage, it's clearly a failure. And this government is failing the people of Saskatchewan when it comes to COVID-19, when it comes to keeping our schools safe, and when it comes to creating jobs. And Mr. Speaker, all 3 of those failures are related. When COVID runs amok in our communities, it takes a terrible toll on our schools. Schools are forced to close, parents left in the lurch without childcare, businesses close, jobs are lost, and the cycle continues. So, Mr. Speaker, when will this government actually come up with a plan to get COVID-19 under control, get vaccines into teachers and frontline staff, and when can we finally start seeing some progress on fixing Saskatchewan's worst in the nation jobs numbers?
Recognize the Minister of Trade and Export Development.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And Saskatchewan residents who have lived here for the past 14 years are aware of the remarkable record on jobs and the economy that this government has, Mr. Speaker. We have seen an increase in our GDP of over 20% over that period of time, Mr. Speaker. We have seen a remarkable 57% increase in the value of our exports from this province to locations and countries right around the planet, Mr. Speaker. We have seen population growth of over 170,000 newcomers to this province, Mr. Speaker, a rate of growth that we have not seen at least since the 1920s, Mr. Speaker. We have seen average weekly earnings, what people take home on their paychecks, increase 46%, Mr. Speaker, over that period of time. Manufacturing sales, that growth has been remarkable, really an untold story, a great success story in our economy. Near 29%, Mr. Speaker, $13.4 billion. Private sector capital investment, Mr. Speaker, something that I can say with great certainty would never have happened under the members opposite. A massive increase of 50%, Mr. Speaker, over that same period of time.
I recognize the member from Regina University.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, there was a question there and whether simply the minister doesn't know his file well enough to answer it or doesn't care to. It's very unclear at this point because, Mr. Speaker, you know what's bad for the economy? Bad for the economy is allowing COVID-19 to get so badly that 1 in 5 children are testing positive here in Regina. And you know what, Mr. Speaker? We can't keep the economy open without getting COVID under control. We can't keep the economy open without keeping schools safe because, Mr. Speaker, childcare is economic infrastructure. Do the members opposite know that we need schools to be open to help create jobs? It's not rocket science. It's what teachers and boards are calling for. Mr. Speaker, when will this government get things under control? Is the Jobs Minister happy enough to try and simply outdo himself month after month with the worst jobs numbers in Canada, or will he make sure that we get a plan to get people back to work?
Recognize the Minister of Trade and Export Development.
Well, Mr. Speaker, my children are 12 and 10, and I'm really not sure where she got the number of 1 in 5 children have COVID in Regina. I just consulted with the Minister of Health, and I would ask her if she has that information to table it, since it would be news to members on this side of the chamber. But, Mr. Speaker, let's remember what the members' opposite position is on the economy. And let's remember what the Leader of the Opposition's position is, even if he won't say it in this chamber, Mr. Speaker. Their position is that the economy needs to be shut down, Mr. Speaker, that 80,000 Saskatchewan employees, whether in Regina, whether in Saskatoon, whether in Prince Albert, whether in Meadow Lake, would be out of a job. They would be out of work for an indefinite period of time, Mr. Speaker. And we know from other jurisdictions, 1/3 of those jobs would not return. That is their position. They can be honest about it. If that's their position, they should say it, Mr. Speaker, because they have on different occasions, but they seem not to be willing to say it anymore. Mr. Speaker, our position is that we have one of the lowest unemployment rates in Canada, 4th lowest unemployment rate in Canada, has been one of the lowest through the entire pandemic, Mr. Speaker. We work very closely with our business community, providing supports that have been the most significant in the entire country, Mr. Speaker, and they would attest to that as well. We're going to continue to do that. We have as a priority the economic recovery of this province, and Mr. Speaker, it's something we're going to continue to focus on.
Ministerial statements. I recognize the Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today, our government introduced the Tobacco and Vapor Products Control Amendment regulations necessary to restrict the sale of flavoured products to adult-only vape shops. The amendments build upon the Tobacco and Vapor Product Control Act, which came into effect early 2020. That act restricts the sale of vapor or e-cigarette devices to products to individuals 18 years of age and older, and restricted the use of vapor e-cigarette products in an all-around public buildings, including schools and school grounds. The Tobacco Vapor Product Control Act was important to ensure that rules and regulations for vaping were the same as they were for tobacco. At the time of the introduction, we committed to looking more specifically at flavored vapor products and how we could further discourage youth from taking up the habit. The Ministry of Health conducted stakeholder consultations in September 2020 specific to the regulation of flavored vapor products and the best next steps to ensure products that taste like fruit and candy are no longer marketed or easily purchased by youth under 18. This consultation included retailers as well as some strong voices for tobacco cessation and health promotion, including the Saskatchewan Lung Association, the Saskatchewan Coalition for Tobacco Reduction, and the Saskatchewan Youth for Change. I would like to thank all of those who participated in this conversation. Tobacco and vapor product control assessment regulations will come into force September 1, 2021, and the Ministry of Health's enforcement officers will be visiting vape shops to ensure that they are aware of the following rules. Saskatchewan tobacco and vaping control measures are enforced by tobacco enforcement officers. Approximately $600,000 is dedicated annually to enforcement and cessation support, like the Smokers Helpline through the Canadian Cancer Society. We continue to work with partner organizations to engage the public and increase awareness through education. The Ministries of Health and Education have provided joint funding to the Lung Association, Saskatchewan, for development of vaping-related youth education resources. These regulations are an important part of prevention. Cessation and education supports help reduce an overall smoking rate as we further support our province youth to making a healthy choice. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the member from Saskatoon Fairview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the Minister opposite for providing a copy of his statement in advance here today. We have been working with the government as much as possible on this legislation since the beginning. So, we worked quickly to ensure swift passage of this bill about a year and a half ago now, Mr. Speaker. Since then, there have been a lot of questions about where vaping flavors were going to go, as we wanted to see how that was going to be borne out in the regulations. In particular, the types of flavors that the minister has raised here today as ones that are fruity and have been criticized for marketing to children, such as bubble gum and cotton candy, these types of things. So I think there are a lot of questions still in terms of the evidence of if flavors are required at all. There are certainly a number of experts who are looking into this quite closely. I think the concern here is with our youth vaping rates in Saskatchewan, and that a new generation is developing a nicotine addiction. And so we know that also we have very high youth smoking rates in our province. Surveys show that Saskatchewan youth have some of the highest smoking rates in Canada. So we're certainly glad to see that there is an attempt to tackle the vaping rates, but we also can't lose sight of the fact that our smoking rates are also very high, and this is also something we should be paying close attention to. It certainly makes sense to limit the accessibility of flavored vaping products to adults-only shops. We've heard from a number of adults who are using vaping as a mode of cessation. We know that that is one side of the picture, and the other side of the picture is our youth who are picking up vaping. It's become so common in schools. The devices are so small and difficult to spot. It's something that teachers in high schools are having to deal with on the regular. But there is also a misconception out there that vaping is safe. We now know about some of the short-term side effects, but there are serious health problems that are associated with vaping. The long-term side effects are something that are not yet known, that are under study, and I think that there should be some education campaigns tied to this as well, particularly as we talk about the dangers of vaping, but also smoking, as I had mentioned, Mr. Speaker. So we're happy to see this action finally taken on this measure, and we know that there is still a lot more work that can be done.
Introduction of bills.
Item number 1, Honourable Mr. Harrison.
I recognize the Minister of Trade and Export Development.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move that Bill 31, the Innovation Saskatchewan Amendment Act 2021, be now introduced and read a first time.
It has been moved by the Minister of Trade and Export Development that Bill number 31 be now introduced and read a first time. Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
First reading of this bill.
When shall the bill be read a second time?
Next sitting.
Next sitting. Presenting reports by standing and special committees. Orders of the day. Government orders.
Government orders adjourn debates. Item number 12. Debates resumed on the second reading motion for Bill number 3, the Massage Therapy Act. Ms. Young.
I recognize the member from Regina Elphinstone Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is a pleasure to rise and provide initial comments on Bill number 3, the Massage Therapy Act. This bill creates a regulatory body for the province's massage therapists, and I'd like to begin by reiterating the comments made by my colleague from Regina University, and that is just to simply recognize what has been a difficult time for massage therapists throughout Saskatchewan, as they are indeed, their profession requires them to engage in prolonged contact, physical contact, and I know it's been a difficult time for many of them. With this bill, the College of Massage Therapy of Saskatchewan is established as the regulatory body for massage therapists. And in general, I believe this to be a welcome bill by this opposition. We do have a few questions about how the consultation took place. I know that there were some bumps along the road in getting it to this point. And I know that our lead critics on this issue did pen a letter to the minister, raising a couple of questions around the template that's being used for regulation. They've asked about the disciplinary process and whether it's been standardized between professions. They have referred to the fact that the bill as it stands does not contain a definition in Section 2, the definition section for the profession, outlining a comprehensive definition for the profession. They have asked whether the public will have access to information about the professional standing of massage therapists, whether there's a plan for a website where clients could search for their massage therapists to remain informed as to any disciplinary decisions or regulatory information. As for the question of membership eligibility, they've asked of the minister how it was determined that the 3 organizations would be eligible for grandfathering, and that whether they hold equal representation on the council, and if so, how that was decided, and what are the relative membership numbers of each organization. There was some concern that the bill may leave out other practicing massage therapists who are not members of the included organizations. So I think that these are not huge issues, but they are details that the critics are hoping that the minister will pay some attention to as this bill is discussed and analyzed. We want to make sure, given that this is a new bill and is the first time that massage therapists will be regulated across the province, that the bill gets it right. With that, I will conclude my remarks on Bill number 3, the Massage Therapy Act, and I will adjourn debate on this bill, Mr. Speaker.
The member has moved to adjourn debate. Is it a pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Agreed. Carried.
Turn debate. Item number 1. Resume debate in the second reading motion for Bill number 4, the Construction Codes Act. Ms. Ritchie.
I recognize the member from Cumberland.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, to join in on the debate Bill number 4, the Construction Codes Act. Before, I guess, getting into some of the comments that the minister referred to and what they're trying to achieve, as your opposition, we always make sure that the industry and those organizations, groups, I guess construction trades, have been consulted and making sure. I know sometimes government says that they've reached out and they, to as much as they can, and then sometimes you'll find out maybe some groups are missed. They get a chance to share their views on what's going on and what's happening. And I know we'll take our time on this bill here. I think it's important, and some of the comments that the minister has made and some of the jurisdiction and powers that will be handed out and different ways of doing the construction and I don't know if it's zoning they're going to get into. I don't know if it's powers when it comes to providing permits. But I do see the minister had quite a bit of comments in there in areas where, now I'm hoping at the end of the day, when you have legislation as big as it is and changes that they're making to the provincial-wide standards or codes that he's proposing and the changes and giving. And I don't know if it's the minister that will have more powers, if it's a local authority that will have more powers, if it's going to be the ministry, who. And I know that, at the end of the day, for our side, for my colleagues, for the critic, we want to make sure that we get this right. When you're making changes like this, that might, and I looked at some of the comments in here he referred to, and I think, and if I understand where he's coming from, is they're making changes with accessibility to buildings with people with disabilities, and if that's what they're ensuring that people with disabilities have access to our buildings. Now, I don't know if that's like public buildings, and I know, is it residential? Is it strictly, big buildings that they're referring to, construction, to making sure they have access, like elevators? Do they have access with stairs, with the size of doors for, people in wheelchairs? So I'm not sure exactly where he's going, and I don't know who they reached out to, and had they reached out to the Disability Association of Saskatchewan, and are they codes when you're going back and forth? Are these provincial codes? Do they work with the federal government, and any of those federal codes have any bearing, or do they have to consult? And I was just looking some of the comments some of my colleagues had asked on the second reading of this, and just making sure we get this right, and when we're bringing legislation like this that I think will impact so many, whether it's somebody building, we want to make sure we get it right, whether it's somebody who's hiring a company who's going to construct the building, to make sure that all those codes are done. The minister also referred into some of that, and I don't know if it's the person who's buying a building, if it's a residential or it's all commercial. Deficiencies, they talk about making sure that deficiencies are done, taken care of when they do the inspections. And truly, I'll be honest with you, that is a much more of an area where some people will definitely have more understanding and knowledge of that industry. And I'm hoping that the government did reach out, and the minister did, and the ministry reached out to all those sectors to talk with them. And I was looking into some of the comments, and it sounded like the minister or the ministry had reached out to some of the associations. I don't know which ones or not, but I know it's important that we get this right when we're making changes like this to legislation, and when we're trying to make sure that residents, whether somebody who's purchasing a property or it's a commercial building, that at the end of the day you've got a brand new building. It meets all the codes and regulations to make sure people have it's accessible for people with disabilities, as they said, but also that a person's paying a company to make sure, from the understanding I got, that they've got a certain standard, certain codes, and that company is well aware of Saskatchewan codes and making sure that whatever needs to be done. And I don't know if that's what he referred to as deficiencies, is if there was codes that were missed or something that you know, a company missed. So when I say this, I'm hoping that you know, the minister and those individuals got the chance and were consulted, because unfortunately sometimes our government says, yeah, they consulted, and yeah, they may have done, but sometimes I've seen how they've said that. Well, I can give examples. Our First Nations, our Métis people, you know, you hear government talk about that. Oh yeah, we consult. Then you find out very little was done on a certain thing. And it's actually embarrassing and sometimes almost insulting to people to say, well, whether it's our trappers, our traditional land users, saying they didn't know that something was happening on their traditional lands. And that's very important. And that's, again, about being consulted. They just want to feel like they were part of that process. So here, when we see legislation like this, I don't know who they consulted with. They can say, well, we consulted with a whole bunch of people. Like, I don't know. And I know our critics can ask some questions. But I also like to put out there for the record, for industry and those that might you know, have something to say about certain bills as legislation comes forward, to make sure that they get a hold of the opposition, the critic, making sure they get the government, to let them know if there's issues, whether it's an email, a letter, a phone call, just some type of a record where you requested that you wanted to have some input into legislation. Because again, at the end of the day, once we pass this, a lot of times, yeah, you can do amendments and we adjust things. Once you give certain powers over to, whether it's the minister, the ministry, or somebody, they don't like giving up those powers too easily. I've learned that once governments, because we've seen where this government has done that, where all of a sudden it used to be a different body, and then all of a sudden it's the minister and his ministry that have the power to change things and do things in the regulations and stuff. And that's really concerning to me. And I know others have said, well, you've taken away the power of a body, and you're now giving it strictly to the minister. And to me, you got to be very careful, Mr. Speaker, when you're doing that. We got to make sure we get this right. And you know, we have to work together, but we want to make sure people in our good province are taken care of. And that's why legislation like this, you need to make sure you get it right. And I don't have a lot of, when it comes to construction and the building, but I know there's industry out there. I know there's experts out there can be approached. And I know my colleague will be doing that, reaching out. And as I said, if there's individuals out there that have something to say, please come forward, because I think it's so crucial just to let a government get away and do whatever they want. And if at the end of the day, government's done a good job and they've consulted with industry, they've consulted with people with disabilities, as I said, they've consulted with those individuals that need to be talked to and have input and advice from. And there are experts out there that you have done that, and you've made sure that those experts have had their say and can tell you what to, and I mean, whether that's, I guess, architects, the list can go on, people with disabilities, either construction trades, business, small companies, big companies. You have to make sure you've done that. Make sure you're reaching out to our communities wherever you can, that this will, municipalities, if it's going to impact municipalities, where their decision on giving permits for residential, is it going to affect them? We have to make sure we've talked to those northern municipalities. If this is going to impact our First Nations or our Métis communities, let's make sure that we've done this, that we've done our job when you're bringing in legislation like this. Because too many times we see this government pat themselves on the back saying that they've done such a great job of consulting and do that. And again, I'm seeing more and more of that when it comes to our First Nations and Métis. And, we see where it is. We talk about that also, our education. I'd like to sometimes show examples, Mr. Speaker. This legislation, as this minister may say, he really consulted. I've seen where they've said they've done a great job of that, and truly, at the end of the day, you find out it hasn't been as good as they thought. They might want to pat themselves on the back saying they did, but they shouldn't do that sometimes, because they've actually haven't done the justice to the file that they're supposed to be looking after. I don't know, Mr. Speaker, if I have much more to say. I know my colleagues will have more to say, and the critic will have more to say, and they'll have an opportunity as this legislation and this act goes forward through the process that it's supposed to be, and as Her Majesty's loyal opposition, to hold government accountable, to make sure people feel like we're doing what we need to do. And sometimes you can work together, but sometimes you have to make sure government gets it right. You can't not get some of this legislation right. You have to make sure, because it will impact industry, people's jobs, livelihood, and we see that, and people's ways of living and quality of life. Legislation like this may impact them, and we don't realize it because you go through it. So let's make sure we get it right before it gets royal assent to go ahead and be the law of this province. We have to get it right. So I'm prepared to adjourn debate on Bill number 4, the Construction Code Act, Mr. Speaker.
The member who has moved to adjourn debate. Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
Government orders adjourn debates. Item number 2, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill 14, the Protection from Human Trafficking Act. Ms. Ritchie.
I recognize the member from Saskatoon Eastview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's an honor to enter into debate on Bill 14, the Protection from Human Trafficking Act. I've heard the comments from my colleagues, from the Minister of Justice, who provided initial comments on this piece of legislation. And, thus far, Mr. Speaker, I'm very pleased to see the level of thoughtfulness, scrutiny, and humanity that is brought to this debate. I think that there's as much reason as any to thoroughly investigate this piece of legislation from the standpoint of an opposition who is concerned with putting people first. When it comes to this particular bill, Mr. Speaker, I did have a chance to review the minister's comments on the bill. And by and large, Mr. Speaker, I appreciated those comments. I think it's important to note when we hear things that we agree with in this assembly. And a few things that stood out to me, I'd like to make a few comments on here in response. I heard the Minister of Justice talk about human trafficking as a heinous crime that preys on the most vulnerable in our society. Mr. Speaker, I appreciate those words as we think about who is vulnerable, who needs protection under the law, and what our province is willing to do to consider those types of people. I think that's important, and I was pleased to hear that in the opening couple sentences from the minister. There's another comment that stuck out, Mr. Speaker, and that's where I'd like to focus the majority of my own response. Is the minister talked about human trafficking as being inherently dehumanizing, exploitative, and controlling. And I'd like to focus in just a little bit on this word, dehumanizing, Mr. Speaker. I think it's an important word, and I'd like to share just a little bit of my understanding of what happens when, or what is the result of dehumanizing ideology. Mr. Speaker, I've come to understand that when we believe things that dehumanize the other, that the end result of that, sometimes in the short run, sometimes long run, the end result of dehumanizing ideology is violence, and sometimes it's death. And so, Mr. Speaker, we need to examine, as we think about this bill and protections for those who are victim of human trafficking, we also need to think about our own beliefs and where we have fallen prey to dehumanizing beliefs about the other. This bill seeks to assist victims and survivors in restoring control over their own lives. But I think for us to understand this, we need to think, well, who is a victim of human trafficking? In Saskatchewan, we're not unlike many places in the world. And predominantly the victims of human trafficking are women and girls. Predominantly in Saskatchewan, the victims of human trafficking are also racialized peoples, people of color, Indigenous peoples. And predominantly there's also often an aspect of poverty. So we have an intersection of three isms that come together here. We have an intersection of sexism, an intersection with racism, and an intersection with classism. And we know that when we have adopted these types of dehumanizing ideologies, that we can come to accept the violence that results of them as being normalized or being having some way to explain its persistence in our society. So I would say, as we debate this bill, we also need to examine what are each of us doing to humanize the other, to think about our shared humanity, to examine the way that we have immersed ourselves in a society that often adopts ideologies of sexism, racism, and classism. We know that in Canada, Mr. Speaker, we have ongoing epidemic of missing Indigenous women and girls. We know that in Canada we have very high rates of education for women and girls in Canada amongst world leaders, and that goes along here in Saskatchewan. But we see indications that sexism still exists, as we have a province which is one of the few remaining in Canada that has not enacted pay equity legislation. We know that when it comes to women and girls in Canada, while they're being educated in world-leading ways, we don't see women in positions of power in our society the way that they are in many other countries around the world. So while they're being educated, we have a lack of women in positions of power in decision-making. And that is certainly true here in this Assembly as well. Mr. Speaker, when we think about the outcomes for racialized people, Saskatchewan is a case study on the material outcomes that result from this archaic kind of thinking. I call it archaic because this hierarchy of racial value is one that has had a long history in Saskatchewan. And so as we think about addressing human trafficking, and I see this word dehumanizing in here, we also need to think about the kinds of ideology that humanizes our neighbors, our community members, and those who need protection in this piece of legislation. I'd like to maybe just reference a few things here, Mr. Speaker. Other concerns that come up is I'd like to know if this piece of legislation will really make a difference for those who are caught up in this exploitation, as the minister described it. What difference will this make for those who are involved as sex workers, those who are forced into the sex trade against their will? Does this potentially make work for those sex workers more dangerous? These are people whose needs need to be considered, and in doing so, we can humanize them. Mr. Speaker, I'm also wondering about if this act actually creates any new protections and remedies for survivors, whether survivors have been consulted. I saw in the minister's comments that there was some consultation that took place with organizations, community-based organizations, those who work with survivors, but I didn't see a specific indication that survivors themselves were consulted, that their stories were heard as part of a fulsome consultation process in relation to this bill. I think it's also important to note that that this bill or that this government has not done a good job recognizing the need for gang reduction strategies in our province as a real way to address the issue of human trafficking. I've had the honor of listening to folks who work in this area over the years, hearing stories of ex-gang members. I think of the work of Father Andre in Saskatoon, and some of these folks who have left a violent gang lifestyle to find acceptance and value in the straight-up family is some of the most profound learning experiences of my life. In closing, Mr. Speaker, I'll just comment that I am very interested in continuing to hear further conversation on this bill. I think that this is one that for the most part, I have appreciated the comments from the minister, from my colleagues. I think that there are lots of good ideas here that certainly we support as an opposition, but I think it's also important that we continue to listen to one another and that we really engage in fulsome and substantive debate on this. So with that, I will move to adjourn debate on Bill number 14, the protection from Human Trafficking Act.
The member has moved to adjourn debate. Is the pledge of assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
Government orders, adjourn debates. Item number 3, resume debate in the second reading motion for Bill 15, the Residential Tenancies Amendment Act 2020. Ms. Young, Regina University.
I recognize the member from Saskatoon Eastview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Honored to again engage in adjourn debate on this time Bill number 15, the Residential Tenancies Amendment Act. It's my understanding that this bill allows for some changes to previous legislation, in particular, including provisions for victims of sexual violence. And I believe that in the past, from reviewing this bill, that previous amendments to the Residential Tenancies Act included interpersonal violence. And so I think this is important that this government has paid attention to the fine detail to include sexual violence as another way to protect folks who are renting and leasing from getting out of those agreements after an episode of violence has taken place. Just a few comments here on this bill, Mr. Speaker. I think it's important to note, and again, I want to go to the minister's comments, that there's kind of just some things that need to be updated here in terms of like housekeeping and administrative improvements. Obviously, those are things that we support as a way to make sure that things run smoothly on the government side and within different government agencies. I'm also paying careful attention to thinking about sexual violence overall and what this bill does to give folks who experience violence a way out of a lease agreement, I think is an important step. But of course, Mr. Speaker, we have to be mindful of the bigger picture here. And when it comes to the bigger picture, we know that again, predominantly victims of sexual violence and interpersonal partner violence in this province, like most places, most of these victims are women. And so I want to just pause for a minute and say that part of the education that needs to happen in this province is everywhere. It's not just about educating women on their rights and changing legislation, but also education that I know does go on in some classrooms and other agencies, but education that helps men, that helps those of us who stand on the other side. If we know that the victims are predominantly women, we know that the perpetrators are predominantly men. And so I think that we need to see some effort from this government to engage in programs that address the issues of violent masculinity and how that is often focused on female victims. I'd also like to comment that I think that the Sask Party government could certainly do a lot more to create a plan in Saskatchewan to address sexual violence. We know that many of the organizations that work in this area have not seen meaningful increase in funding in nearly a decade. And so I think that this will also be something pertinent to state and debate on this bill about residential tenancies, rights, and responsibilities. To also recognize that we need to do more in this province overall to create a plan and to fund that through our community-based organizations and shelters. Just a couple more comments here to wrap up. I think that, from our perspective as an opposition, we're very supportive of any measure that will help to support survivors of sexual violence. We're certainly interested in ensuring that those measures are done correctly and with proper consultation of survivors and those working on the front lines. I've heard, many of my colleagues speak passionately to one big area of concern in this bill, Mr. Speaker, and that has to do with the changes for eviction notice for non-payment of rent that this bill makes provisions for that to be reduced from 15 days down to 7. And again, I've heard my colleagues speak passionately about the realities for folks who are, maybe waiting for their social assistance and who, can't predict that within this very small time frame that they couldn't be have proceedings started by a landlord looking for payment that they're not able to provide. And so I think that this is where consultation with those who are at risk of this would be very valuable. And I think it's upon the government to listen to those folks, to listen to the advocacy groups that work in the areas of sexual violence in the province, and that they would definitely hear a different story that would make this provision seem inhumane. With that, Mr. Speaker, I'm ready to conclude my remarks here, and I'm also again very interested in hearing continued debate on this from my colleagues in opposition, and interested to see what our critics says when this goes to committee. But at this time, I will move that we adjourn debate on Bill number 15, the Residential Tenancies Amendment Act.
The member has moved to adjourn debate. It is a pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Government orders, adjourn debates. Item number 4, resume debate in the second reading motion for Bill 17, the Traffic Safety Miscellaneous Amendments Act 2020. Ms. Beck.
Recognize the member from Saskatoon University.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm happy to offer initial comments on behalf of the official opposition with respect to Bill 17, the Traffic Safety Miscellaneous Amendment Act 2020. We see here some very comprehensive changes being made to traffic safety in our province. I think it was already noted, about 20 pages of changes, so we've got a lot to dig into there. We're in principle, of course, very supportive of measures to ensure the people of our province are kept safe while on the road. My colleagues who have spoken to this bill already have flagged some questions and have highlighted the importance of ensuring that these changes are fair. Just to summarize this Amendment Act, I may not go through all of them, but I'll go through some of the main ones. The Act authorizes the administrator to suspend, cancel, or refuse to issue a driver's license where the holder of that driver's license suffers from a medical condition that affects the safe operation of a vehicle, and that driver fails to file a medical report with the administrator. It requires the holder of a driver's license to self-report a medical condition to the administrator if that medical condition may affect the safe operation of a vehicle. I think this is pretty common sense. Requires the use of a standardized bill of sale for the purpose of selling a vehicle, trailer, or semi-trailer. I think this is, again, good common sense. I myself bought a 1977 Travel off a farmer in Laird a couple of years back, and we didn't have this kind of a form. We just wrote it on a napkin, and that was acceptable, but probably would make things a lot more efficient to have a standardized bill of sale. It also requires motorcycle drivers who obtain a registration permit to carry that permit on their person or in the motorcycle. Again, pretty straightforward. Removes the requirement for charter buses to display a sign bearing the word charter. I'm not sure what the need for this is exactly, but I'm interested to hear what that is. It modernizes and harmonizes the processes and procedures applicable to garage keepers who store and dispose of impounded motor vehicles, and procedures applicable to garage keepers who store, got that double here. So we do have more questions around that. I'm sure the critic will have more detailed questions as to what that entails. It clarifies the time period within which a court action under the Automobile Accident Insurance Act for pain and suffering and bereavement damages must be brought. Clarifies that the authority and process for issuing and prosecuting red light camera tickets applies to both images captured and also video. Clarifies that speed monitoring devices may be operated, and then it defines a whole list of different terms here for the purpose of authorizing and regulating the electronic exchange of information between the administrator and authorized parties upon the customer's consent. So, that's a bit of a summary, so there's a lot to get into here. With that, I'm sure the critic will have much more detail in terms of questions digging into these in committee, and with that, I'm prepared to conclude my remarks. So, Mr. Speaker, I move that we adjourn debate on Bill 17, the Traffic Safety Miscellaneous Amendment Act 2020.
Member has moved to adjourn debate. Is the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
Government orders adjourn debates. Item number 5, resume debate in the second reading motion for Bill number 18, the All-Terrain Vehicles Amendment Act 2020. Mr. Vermette.
I recognize the member from Saskatoon Eastview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Happy to enter debate again, this time for Bill number 18, the All-Terrain Vehicles Amendment Act of 2020. Now, Mr. Speaker, I've had taken time to review this piece of legislation, which makes, I think, a few very important and, non-controversial changes to a previous piece of legislation. And I have also reviewed the minister's initial comments related to the All-Terrain Vehicles Amendment Act. And what I'm going to try my best to do is to not talk for longer than the Minister of Crown Investments Corporation, who didn't offer a lot of comments on this, but did pick out some of the key details here, which I think by and large are things that we as opposition see as positive changes. First of all, we note that Clause 3 amends the definition of all-terrain vehicle to include vehicles that were originally built with wheels and now they're modified to have tracks. So not much there in terms of concern. We also note that Clause 4 clarifies provisions that allow those over 12 years old to operate an all-terrain vehicle when accompanied by a licensed adult, and that there's also going to be a change in how, I think in the past, a driver's license was required if you're over 16, and obviously, I think of many of my former students who were at the age of getting their driver's licenses, and while that sometimes terrified me, also know that they don't always pass the first time, and it sometimes takes a little while, and I think this is a very positive change to see that those who do engage in ATV use would still be allowed to do that, even if they were either not successful or chose not to pursue a driver's license. So again, positive changes there. And of course, taking the course and having some training, having somebody there in a supervisory role who had achieved that, all seem as positive things to make sure that our young folks can safely engage in ATV use in Saskatchewan. We know it's a popular activity and pastime for lots of folks, and we just want to ensure that there's regulatory framework in place to ensure that people are safe, including, of course, our young people. I know that our SGI critic will have more detailed questions as this bill proceeds at that point. So with that, I am certainly interested in hearing further comments from members of the opposition on this bill as we engage in fulsome debate. But at this time, I will move that Bill 18, the All-Terrain Vehicles Amendment Act 2020, that we adjourn debate on the bill.
The member has moved to adjourn debate. Is it pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
Government orders adjourn debates. Item 6, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 19, the Human Resources Profession Act. Mr. Love.
Recognize the member from Saskatoon-Nutana.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a pleasure to offer initial comments on behalf of the official opposition on Bill 19, the Human Resources Profession Act. I do note that this is an act that is here to establish as a corporation chartered professionals in human resources and provide them with a framework for being able to self-regulate as a profession, and this will allow them to establish rules for meetings and appointing boards, establishing a set of bylaws, undertaking disciplinary action, having hearings, and the like. I thank the minister opposite for introducing the bill and providing some initial comments. I have to say, though, that I was a bit disappointed that there weren't more specifics provided in terms of, the need for the legislation. And, certainly as someone who also belongs to a self-regulating body under the Association of Professional Engineers and Geoscientists of Saskatchewan, I certainly do have a very high level of understanding and appreciation of the importance of the ability to regulate. Obviously, there are some very distinct differences between a profession like engineering, which offers license, and the fact that this won't. But nevertheless, certainly, I think it's always, of course, a balance, ensuring that we ensure that when we allow for self-regulation, that we ensure that this is a profession that is indeed ready to take on that responsibility. And I think that goes to say for any type of legislation. Indeed, I think it's always a key tenet where, I think that the government opposite has had a very strong preference towards self-regulation in many aspects of the economy and professional societies, but I do also offer that caution in terms of the importance to make sure that that there is adequate consultation occurring to understand what the desire and the need is for such legislation, and that it is in fact meeting those needs, and that there is that capacity within that profession. And certainly, of course, human resource professionals, it has over time become very distinct. They possess a distinct body of knowledge and professionalism in the work that they undertake, and there can be issues that can indeed crop up from time to time, so that ensuring that that they're acting with the utmost level of professionalism, and we see that in other areas. I do note that massage therapy, for example, is another area that has been asking for that same kind of legislation, and to the best of my knowledge right now, that is not something that has come forward. So again, in the broader context, I think it's important that we're identifying those professions that are in need of this legislation, and that we're ensuring that where there is the greatest risks of issues arising, that we're pursuing those across all areas of professions operating here in Saskatchewan, and human resource professionals, not the least of which. And I think that in support of the legislation, because I think there can be points for and against it, and certainly the critic for this legislation will be in committee delving into some of these issues, but certainly on the need for that professionalism, I think that the legislation, I hope it will be able to address that, to ensure that when human resource professionals are acting as agents on behalf of their employers, that they're acting with regard for due fairness and balance in the role that they perform, when essentially operating as a moderator between workers and employers. And that's a really important role that they play, ensuring that both sides are properly protected, represented, and in the case of workers, of course, that there isn't unintended negative consequences arising from this legislation that gets in the way of their ability to have their rights met as workers. And I think that's an important consideration. I don't know the extent to which the human resource professionals incorporate that into their bylaws, but I think it'll be an important consideration. And I would just go back to my earlier point about, as someone who has been part of a regulated profession my entire career, that I see the value and the worth in it when done right, and ultimately here we want to make sure that we do get this legislation right, that we've consulted widely enough to ensure that all stakeholders' views, including those of workers, are considered as this legislation is contemplated. And that we're also building on best practice of other jurisdictions who have implemented similar legislation. Really, that's all I had to say about this particular piece of legislation. And so, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to move we adjourn debate on Bill number 19, the Human Resources Profession Act.
The member has moved to adjourn debate. It is a pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
From orders, adjourn debates. Item number 13, resume debate in the second reading motion for Bill number 20, the Publicly Funded Health Entity Public Interest Disclosure Act. Ms. Ritchie.
Recognize the member from Regina Elphinstone Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a pleasure to rise on second reading and offer initial comments on Bill number 20, the Publicly Funded Health Entity Public Interest Disclosure Act. This is a new bill that allows whistleblowers to report concerning situations at work without fear of reprisals, and it will apply to employees of the SHA and the Saskatchewan Cancer Agency. My understanding is there's an option to include other organizations through regulation. Mr. Speaker, it is the position of the opposition that this bill could not have come sooner, and it could not be coming at a better time. There is a chill effect in this province, and there's a hesitancy to speak out, and it's one of the core features of working under this government, I would argue. So this bill is welcome, and it's something that the NDP has been calling for really since 2019. There were a few scenarios that demonstrated the sort of crucial need for this legislation. That of the termination of Peter Bowden, who spoke out about what he witnessed and observed in long-term care. He was terminated for the comments and the observations that he made. He was quite candid with that experience about how it tarnished his reputation. He described the whole situation as living hell. The Orwellian hush memo that was sent around to physicians in November of 2019, the NDP spoke out about that memo. And of course, the situation of Carolyn Strom, who was a public nurse here in Saskatchewan, who spoke out about her grandfather's experience at a long-term care home. She did so on social media. She was fined, she was disciplined, but was finally vindicated at the Court of Appeal here in Saskatchewan, and then at the highest court in the land, the Supreme Court of Canada, Mr. Speaker. In this era of COVID, we have seen in sort of the stark reality of what government decisions can do. How government decisions can lead to unnecessary loss of life, prolong the prolongation of pandemics, and we have seen how the refusal to take certain action has a real impact on the ground. And so the importance of allowing the hardworking professionals that make up these systems, about allowing them to speak truths about what is really happening is just so important, without fear of reprisal, of course. And it's not just that, it also speaks to the basic duty of professionals, whether it's a physician or a nurse or a teacher or a public lawyer. When you undertake that public work, you enter into a bond with the community you're serving. Often you're the only one who really knows what's happening in those systems, who's really in a position to observe the ins and outs. And you have a unique credibility in terms of speaking out on what you observe, but you also have a clout that other members of the community lack, because of course you're a professional, you know the system, you work in the system. So the ability of professionals to speak out about what they observe is really key to a functioning democracy, Mr. Speaker. And I had a very interesting experience which really brought home the importance of this, the autonomy that should be given to professionals in criticizing the systems in which they work. When I was a public defender with legal aid, I was president of my union. And at the time, our employer tried to introduce a code of conduct that limited what we said about the legal system on social media, and we really pushed back on this. And in time, the Carolyn Strome decision was released, and the employer dropped it. They didn't attempt to pursue this any further. But it did prompt some discussions between myself and my colleagues about this kind of responsibility that we had to our clients to speak out when the systems that were theoretically built to serve them were failing them. So that was sort of some personal experience I had with the chill effect that can come with not having legislation that could protect professionals who find themselves in that circumstance. I do want to just address the situation, or the decision rather, that was made with respect to Carolyn Strome's decision, because I think there are a few key things that were teased out by the Court of Appeal in that decision that I think are really important to emphasize. And one of the things that the Court of Appeal looked at was that someone in Carolyn Strome's situation, or any healthcare worker, has a freedom of expression. And if discipline is being contemplated by their governing body, that governing body has to consider their charter rights when entertaining any kind of disciplinary decision. I think that's really important. The other thing that was reinforced by that decision, which I think is so crucial in this economic era that we find ourselves in, is the autonomy, the personal autonomy and private life of professionals. And so that decision really reinforced that, when you're off duty, there's certain things that you have the right to do. Not every waking moment can be determined by the interests of your employer, and I think that's just so powerful to keep in mind. You are not just a worker, you're a person. So that decision reinforced our basic humanity. In Carolyn Strome's situation, she was the daughter. She was a daughter as well as a nurse. She's the daughter of someone who is not getting proper care in our long-term care system. What this reinforcement of the humanity of public workers does is it reinforces that they need not be silent in the face of suffering, and they need not be silent in the face of observing failures within in the systems that they work. The decision also points to the fact that a level of criticism and honesty enhances not only the professions, but the systems in which professionals are working. It only serves to enrich in the debate, enrich and enliven the debate. It strengthens our democracy. And I think this is what we all hope for. It may even improve the systems overall. It may improve the systems that these criticisms target. And that's something that the disciplinary committee failed to consider in Carolyn Strome's situation, is the reason that she was speaking out and how this not only could have served to enhance the profession of nurses, because people would look at that and say, wow, that's a really brave thing to do. She's standing up for making our healthcare system better, for giving patients a voice. Not just that, but also enhance long-term care. If the pressure that's applied to government is significant enough as a result of professionals speaking out about what's happening on the ground, the hope is that those systems can be improved. So with that context, Mr. Speaker, this is a piece of legislation that this opposition supports. I think that we want to explore some of the details at committee. There is some concern that the definition of wrongdoing in the Act could be broader and brought into consistency with Alberta legislation. There's a few little housekeeping items, but generally speaking, this legislation is welcome, and it's really a time where we're seeing the importance of this, with healthcare leaders taking to social media, speaking to the media in sort of record numbers about the failures on the COVID-19 front. This bill reinforces that kind of conduct not only enhances the profession that those healthcare workers find themselves parts of, but increase the probability, one would hope, that this government may take the steps that are needed to make the changes that are so badly needed in our long-term care system, in our public health care system. So with that, Mr. Speaker, it's a pleasure to offer these comments on Bill number 20, and I would move to adjourn debate on the Publicly Funded Health Entity Public Interest Disclosure Act.
The member has moved to adjourn debate. Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
Government orders adjourn debates. Item number 7, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 21, the Safer Communities and Neighbourhoods Amendment Act 2020. Ms. Beck. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to offer initial comments on behalf of the official opposition with respect to Bill 21, the Safer Communities and Neighbourhoods Amendment Act 2020. Here we have several changes being made to the Act. I'll give a brief summary. Changes to the language about cannabis to reflect provincial and federal legislation. This is since legalization. Also allows people outside of the neighbourhood in question to make a complaint. There's changes around timing and process for required notice of safety orders. There's updated powers and obligations of the director. It allows the disclosure of information to other orders of government and law enforcement. And there are changes made to language around gangs and fine structure. What I would note is we need to ensure there's an appropriate balance struck and that the needs of tenants are taken into consideration, as well as the safety of the neighbourhood. My colleague, the member for Regina Lakeview, had already previously noted that we would like to know who is asking for this legislation and for these amendments and why. I also note here that the minister had made mention of chronic community problems. I'm not so sure that this bill truly addresses chronic community problems. My colleague from Regina Elphinstone Centre had pointed out that what the opposition would crucially like to see is that the root causes of crime, things like poverty, addictions, and a lack of adequate housing, are addressed by this government. This is what will truly make for safer communities, Mr. Speaker. So I'm sure that the critic in this case will have many more questions in committee, and I will now conclude. And so, Mr. Speaker, I move that we adjourn debate on Bill 21, the Safer Communities and Neighborhoods Amendment Act 2020.
The member has moved to adjourn debate. Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
Government orders adjourn debates. Item number 8, resume debate on the second reading motion on Bill number 23, the Emergency Planning Amendment Act 2020. Mr. Love.
I recognize the member from Saskatoon Fairview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my pleasure to enter into debate today on Bill number 23, the Emergency Planning Amendment Act 2020. There are a number of changes that are being proposed in this act, mainly in relation to public health orders. And the minister identified that a number of these things are sort of lessons learned as we've made our way through the pandemic in terms of some pretty substantive changes around what the existing provisions provide. A couple of these are related to the fines that are in place for breaking public health orders. I know there have been a number of folks who, you know, we've all made sacrifices throughout this pandemic over the past year. Those sacrifices have looked different for different individuals, families, and businesses, but we know it's been hard on all of us. And we know it's important to follow those public health orders because they're being put in place to protect us ultimately as a province. But we also know that there are folks who will break those public health orders, and the minister's response is to increase the fines that exist. So the proposed legislation increases the maximum fine for individuals who are guilty of an offense from $2,000 to $7,000 and increases the maximum fine for corporations who are guilty of an offense from $10,000 to $100,000. I think, Mr. Speaker, we have a number of questions about these changes. I'm curious how they compare to other jurisdictions. So whether these fines are comparable. I'm also curious about how effectively the fining of individuals and corporations has been working thus far. If there is a sense from government about whether these increases will lead to less people breaking the public health orders, because I think ultimately that's our shared goal, is that there will be less people who violate these public health orders. And I think we want to make sure that the efficacy of these measures is in line with what the government expects it will be. So it would be interesting to know about what the rates look like in other provinces, as well as what compliance looks like in other provinces. There's also a new provision in here that updates subsection 18.1 that allows the minister to provide, maintain, and coordinate emergency law enforcement during an emergency period, allows for the collection, use, and disclosure of information the minister considers necessary in relation to an emergency. And then there's also some housekeeping changes that have been added in there. Other than that, it looks like there are mostly updates to language. So I think the most substantive piece that we would have questions about would be that section around the fines, making sure they're working as we intend them to. We've raised a few times that we haven't really been approached to pass this bill speedily, and I think that you know, we've had a chance to look at it, we've had a chance to talk about it. I know we're going to have more questions in committee, Mr. Speaker, but at this point we are prepared to allow this bill to move on to its next steps.
The question before the Assembly is a motion by the member that Bill number 23 be now read a second time. Is the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
Second reading of this bill.
I recognize the Minister of Trade and Export Development.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I designate that Bill number 23, the Emergency Planning Amendment Act 2020, be referred to the Standing Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice.
This bill stands committed to the Standing Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice.
Government orders adjourn debates. Item number 9, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 24, the Vehicles for Hire Amendment Act 2020. Ms. Ritchie.
I recognize the member from Saskatoon University.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I look forward to offering initial comments on behalf of the opposition with respect to Bill 24, the Vehicles for Hire Amendment Act 2020. I'll give a quick summary of the bill. This bill requires a transportation network company, taxi service, or limousine service to follow requirements for driver licensing and criminal record checks. It makes it an offence to operate a transportation network company in Saskatchewan if not properly insured. It also makes it an offence for a transportation network company to operate in a municipality without authorization from the municipality. And there is also a new immunity clause that protects the government of Saskatchewan and SGI from legal action related to actions made in good faith by the government or SGI. Mr. Speaker, the opposition supports a fair and level playing field for taxis, ride shares, and limousines. We'll be checking with stakeholders for sure to ensure that there are no unintended consequences with these amendments. And it's already been noted by one of my colleagues that a key concern around ride-sharing companies in particular is ensuring that these companies are subject to the same safety requirements and employment standards as their competitors. The gig economy is something that is worrisome, and I think we need to ensure that all workers are properly protected in our society and precarity is avoided. We do have some concerns with the SGI immunity clause and would like to know why the government feels that this is the right thing to do. So I don't have much more to add here, Mr. Speaker, and so I will move that we adjourn debate on Bill 24, the Vehicles for Hire Amendment Act 2020.
The member has moved to adjourn debate. It's the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Government orders adjourn debates. Item number 10, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 26, the Police Serious Incident Response Team Amendment Act 2021. Mr. Lowe.
Recognize the member from Saskatoon, Utana.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a pleasure to offer comments on behalf of the official opposition on Bill number 26, the Police Serious Incident Response Team Amendment Act 2021. This is important legislation, and I'm very honored to be able to speak here today on the legislation and the amendments. And I'll maybe just start by mentioning that the changes that are significantly important to this legislation is implementing a civilian-led team to investigate serious incidents involving police officers. And, you know, today of all days is such an important time to be discussing this legislation. We know that in the United States, the trial of Derek Chauvin is currently underway, and considering his actions as a police officer that led to the death of George Floyd, and we await that decision, as I understand it at the moment. But you know, certainly here in Saskatchewan, there's been no shortage of issues and cases where citizens have, you know, suffered and been unfairly and not just unfairly, but reprehensibly treated at the hands of police officers and not received justice. And I'm sure we all recall with great, you know, just disdain the case of Neil Stonechild and incidents of the Starlight tours that many Indigenous men and other youth were subjected to in the 90s, and then also more recently the case of Colton Boushie and the horrible treatment that his family received in the aftermath of his death, and which led to the Civilian Review and Complaints Commission determining that the RCMP had racially discriminated against Bouchier's mom, that they had failed to protect key evidence, they had delayed a search warrant and destroyed important transcripts for that investigation that prevented justice from being done in the case of Colton Boushie and his family, a very tragic incident. And so, we are very, very pleased to see this important piece of legislation come forward that will strike, we hope, a better, not a better balance, but, ensure that there is appropriate accountability in the system to ensure that these kinds of distasteful and disdainful acts don't happen again, that families aren't subjected to such ill treatment. And this is an issue that's been very much in the public eye in the last number of years. I've relayed a couple cases in particular that I think have acted as a catalyst for this legislation coming forward. I was very honored to participate in, the Black Lives Matter rallies last spring when there was an upswelling of outrage and concern over the horrific treatment of George Floyd. We saw that right around the globe, and of course here in Saskatchewan. I, myself, and many others also were displaying placards that also indicated that not only do Black Lives Matter, but also Indigenous lives, in our particular context here in Saskatchewan. I think that it is reflective of a society that still suffers greatly from systemic and structural racism. It is part of our colonial past here in Saskatchewan, and one that we desperately need to wrestle with as a province. And so I think this legislation is a positive step forward in ensuring that we have appropriate accountability and transparency in our police system, and that people's rights are upheld and protected. I don't want to give the impression, though, of course, that I am not supportive of police forces and the work that they do. It's always unfortunate when we have individuals who go against what are to be expected to be normal, or not normal, but expected behavior of police officers in their line of duty. And but that's not to say that there isn't need for improvement and that more needs to be done at all levels. It is a case, yes, of individual actions, but it is also a case of systemic structural issues, and the leadership within our police organizations ensuring that they are ensuring a organizational culture that is respectful and accountable. And I think those are the main points that I want to make. Of course, as with all of these bills, we want to see that there is good consultation occurring, that all stakeholders are heard from, and that we ensure that our police officers and forces are receiving the supports and the tools that they need to do their jobs, and that they're there's been lots of calls to defund police as well, and different approaches are being looked at the municipal level. I am aware of that, and because I think that sometimes what we're asking of our police officers is more than they're really trained to provide in their roles, and there's, I think, lots of opportunity for other professionals to be part of response teams to ensure that there is the appropriate level of response and that we don't have these kinds of serious incidents from occurring in the first place as well. And again, I would just make the observation that with a number of these pieces of legislation, these are really things that are trying to address issues of when things go wrong. And of course, as a New Democrat, I'm always very much focused on how do we get the system right in the first place to prevent and avoid such instances from occurring in the first place. And of course, this being no different from that. And I'm sure that our critic for this area will have more to say as this bill goes to committee. We're pleased to see these amendments and want to make sure that it strikes the right balance. And so with that, Mr. Speaker, I will move that we adjourn debate on Bill 26, the Police Serious Incident Response Team Amendment Act 2021.
The member has moved to adjourn debate. It is the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Government orders adjourn debates. Item number 11. Resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 27, the Summary Offences Procedure Amendment Act 2021. Ms. Ritchie.
Recognize the member from Regina Elphinstone Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is a pleasure to rise and offer initial comments on Bill number 27, the Summary Offences Procedure Amendment Act 2021. I understand that this bill is introduced to make it slightly easier and more efficient to resolve traffic tickets with improvements and access to online systems to resolve some of these issues. I understand that it is also the government's hope that this legislation will reduce the considerable strain on our courts, which I had the opportunity to observe on a daily basis as counsel for Legal Aid Saskatchewan here in Regina. Certainly, any piece of legislation that introduces additional flexibility is welcomed by this opposition. I see here that there is more ease of access to applications for extensions, for example, for time to pay certain fines. That's a welcome suggestion. My understanding is that this bill extends the ability of justices to, this bill provides justices the ability to extend timelines for defendants based on their personal circumstances. In my view, any piece of legislation that provides a measure of discretion and flexibility to a frontline justice or judge navigating the strains in our court system, generally speaking, are welcome changes. They're in the best position to understand the personal circumstances of the defendants that find themselves appearing before them, and certainly they should be provided with as much flexibility as possible to arrive at a just result. We know that COVID has posed significant challenges for our courts. And if it takes a pandemic to bring some of these systems into the 21st century, so be it. Generally speaking, I would just caution that we not sacrifice, the rights of defendants in our push for more efficiency in the justice system. And as far as I can tell, this bill attempts to strike the right balance. It provides for holding trials in electronic format, and it extends early resolution options. There's options to engage in case management discussions. Again, I think this will likely be a welcome development by the courts and judges and prosecutors and defendants alike on the ground. Just a word of caution when we're looking at legislation like this. I think we tend to overstate the promises of kind of some of these technological advancements, particularly when we keep in mind the folks that often find themselves before the courts, and that's mainly marginalized folks who, in my experience, sometimes struggled to maintain a consistent phone number, let alone had consistent access to internet and a computer. So I would hope that as this legislation rolls out, there's a close eye being kept on whether it's having the impact that legislators are hoping that it will have. As we know, oftentimes, the vast majority of individuals that come before the courts are often marginalized, and they face many barriers. And many of the offenses, the underlying offenses that take them, that lead to them appearing before the courts are what one would call administrative offenses, rather than substantive offenses. So failure to abide by certain conditions, and that to me is one of the great injustices of our court system. And if we took a look at that, we would increase the efficiency of our court system. We'd improve the efficacy of our court system if we really were focusing on substantive offenses rather than administrative offenses. Often people face a lot of barriers to follow conditions, and that includes barriers to, for example, paying their fines on time. And there have been decisions on these fines that are imposed on individuals that are convicted of offenses, how they often serve to reinforce some of the marginalization that folks are dealing with, especially as it pertains to the offenses that are associated with marginalization, rather than some of the more significant substantive offenses that one could imagine. The one piece of this legislation that I did want to touch on specifically is on that note, and it's a segue actually into discussions of the fine option program. I mentioned that often this program serves to further marginalize the individuals that find themselves before the courts. And I am glad to see that that this legislation has added alternatives to paying fines. My understanding is that there is there's new aspects of this legislation that will help individuals who can't afford to pay their fines, and it will also assist the community organizations that could benefit from that person's, I don't know if I can call it volunteer work, but they would benefit from that involvement from defendants, and it would help those who cannot afford to pay these fines. So that is a welcome development, Mr. Speaker. As I know, the fine option program is something that this opposition supports. Ideally, we'd see a world without these fines, but certainly the fine option program is a welcome addition. I would just add that often what I observed in court is that we spent more time, effort, and resources trying to track people down to get them to pay these quite insignificant fines in the scheme of things when you're talking about public services and the public coffers. But of course, these fines were relatively quite onerous for the individuals that were struggling to pay them. And it didn't really make a lot of sense to me that we were pursuing these fines. But the fine option program is something that has been very important for people struggling to pay those fines on the ground. So with those comments, Mr. Speaker, I will move to adjourn debate on Bill number 27, the Summary Offences Procedure Amendment Act 2021. Thank you.
The member has moved to adjourn debate. It is the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Government orders adjourned debates. Item number 14, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 28, the Active Family Benefit Act 2021. Ms. Beck.
I recognize the member from Saskatoon University.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm happy to offer initial comments on behalf of the official opposition with respect to Bill 28, the Active Families Benefit Act 2021. I'll give a brief summary of the bill. The bill allows eligible individuals to receive up to $150 per eligible child per taxation year. And then this also is increased to $200 per child eligible for a disability tax credit, which I think is really important. We all know that there's extra costs associated with activities for children that live with a disability, and so that's great to see that recognized. Those who are eligible and are accessing this benefit must retain receipts and provide those receipts to the minister on request. And Cabinet also has the ability to regulate the prescribed activities, eligibility, and expenses. Mr. Speaker, as some of my colleagues have already noted, it's worth reminding folks that this bill is simply a restart of the Active Families Benefit, a program that was actually cut by this government back in 2016. It would be nice if families in our province could have some actual stability in terms of the benefits they are eligible for. And I would be interested to know why this government feels that kids over the last 5 years didn't also deserve this benefit. Glad at least that this government has recognized their error in eliminating the benefit in 2016 and is making an effort to correct that. Ultimately, this bill will assist Saskatchewan families with affordability, which of course we are very much in support of and is very much needed. I know, Mr. Speaker, myself as a child, I grew up with a single mom, and lots of activities were not available to us, most activities really, and opportunities. And so I think that this is very important to level the playing field in terms of families who are not as well off, don't have that expendable, disposable income like some other families may have. And so I think this is great to see that being leveled a bit. And this will be discussed in further detail, I suppose, at committee by the critic. And Mr. Speaker, I have nothing more here to comment on, so I'll move that we adjourn debate on Bill 28, the Active Families Benefit Act 2021.
The member has moved to adjourn debate. It is the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Government orders adjourn debates. Item number 16, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 29, the Supporting Saskatchewan Restaurants Act. Mr. Vermette.
Recognize the member from Regina University.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my pleasure to enter some remarks here today on behalf of the opposition in regards to Bill number 29, an act to support Saskatchewan restaurants. I understand the desire to have this bill move expeditiously to committee, so I'll just offer some preliminary remarks that I will be raising again, but by way of notice. In regards to the view of the opposition, this is a good bill that unfortunately does not go quite far enough. Specifically, the cap at 18% is something that we would like to see move to 15%. In addition, while I understand the intent is to ensure that there is no cost passed on to the employees, we want to ensure that this is the case and just provide that measure of added scrutiny as certainly employees for third-party delivery apps have significantly less transparency when it comes to understanding how they're remunerated than many others, Mr. Speaker. And in particular, we have some concerns around 3.2 as it relates to food delivery service providers charging an amount for services other than food and beverage delivery services. Mr. Speaker, we've seen in other jurisdictions in Canada where caps have been put in place that the companies in question have then proceeded to add an additional charge to these bills. Certainly, this is something that we saw in BC. These companies moved to add what they called a BC tax onto the bill, which was then passed on to residents. And I understand the goal of this, and certainly our belief in the spirit of this, is to support local restaurants. This was something that we called for, and we were really happy to see introduced. While we do believe it doesn't go quite far enough, the goal of this is, of course, to support local restaurants which have been very hard hit by COVID-19, very hard hit by restrictions, and to keep these dollars circulating in the local economy, Mr. Speaker, not going back to those third-party companies. And finally, Mr. Speaker, I think that the last comment that I would offer before I conclude my remarks is that, of course, while we're supportive of a cap being in place, this is something that we think should stay in place. This should not just be a temporary measure. Certainly, the food and beverage sector has been very hard hit by the government's own budget documents. This is one of the hardest hit sectors in the province, and this is a sector that needs some assistance, and allowing what we believe to be a common sense and ethical cap on these fees, not just until the end of summer, but going forward, will ensure that this struggling sector can get back on their feet, get back to employing people, and get back to the business of providing Saskatchewan people with delicious, locally prepared food and beverages. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I will conclude my remarks.
The question before the Assembly is a motion by the member that Bill number 29 be now read a second time. Is the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
Second reading of this bill.
To which committee shall this bill be committed?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I designate that Bill 29, the Supporting Saskatchewan Restaurants Act, be referred to the Standing Committee on the Economy.
The bill stands committed to the Standing Committee on the Economy.
Government orders adjourn debates. Item number 15, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 30, the Saskatchewan Technology Startup Incentive Amendment Act. Mr. Vermette.
Recognize the member from Saskatoon-Utana.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a pleasure to offer initial comments on behalf of the official opposition on Bill number 30, the Saskatchewan Technology Startup Incentive Amendment Act 2021. So this is a bill that will extend the existing incentive for startups 5 more years out to 2026. It's a 45% tax rebate for eligible startups on eligible shares, and it's retroactive to March 31st, 2021. And so, of course, you know, I think we're pleased with this extension and incentive, which is going to go a long way towards supporting our tech industry. A vital industry here in Saskatchewan that shows great promise for growth, and I would just say that you know, it's although it is a great undertaking and incentive that it's providing, I would say that my concerns relate to The other factors that also contribute to ensuring that we have a healthy tech industry here in Saskatchewan, that we have a thriving ecosystem that promotes innovation, and that we also have a pipeline of young graduates and those that are educated in our post-secondary institutions that are ready to enter this space that shows such great promise here in Saskatchewan. And one of my ongoing concerns has to do with how we're failing our students in our education system by not investing enough in teachers and in classrooms to ensure that every child in Saskatchewan has the best opportunity to get a good education and one that supports them so that they can be part of this emergent sector here, as we see not just in Saskatchewan, and it's a very competitive space, and one that we want to make sure that our kids are ready to take advantage of. And I'm afraid that with the lack of investment that we've been seeing and the strain and pressure that's been put on our youth, that we're not going to be able to see the uptake and acceleration that we really need to see here, not just to promote growth and provide job opportunities here in the province, but also participate in that transition and diversification that we need to see moving forward as we green our economy and provide clean technology. And when it comes to attracting investments and attracting Canadians and other people to come to our province to start up these tech companies, my other concern relates to the kind of environment that we're providing for those prospective workers and companies, and it relates to how important it is that our cities and our towns are offering a range of amenities and are progressive communities, lively, prosperous communities that people really truly want to move to and be part of. And that also takes government policy and government funding to ensure that we have vibrant arts communities and cultural spaces, that we're investing in things like the Meewasin Valley Authority and the Wascana Park here in Regina. And without that broader picture or understanding about the things that really support tech investment here in the province, I fear that this incentive will fail in its undertaking. I did note that that the government purports that we've got a lower cost of living and a competitive tax structure and a robust tech sector here in Saskatchewan, but I really feel that the government is out of touch and living in la-la land here a little bit in terms of appreciating those intangible factors that really are going to draw people. Of course, it's about a competitive tax environment, no doubt. But it's these other life factors too that we can't forget about. We got to make sure that we are offering opportunities in communities that are welcoming, that are open and inclusive. People look at Saskatchewan, and I've said this before, but they look at our history of colonial, our past, and the issues that we're addressing with acknowledging our Indigenous community and partners. And I think until we're able to wrestle to the ground some of these really deep-rooted issues and become a much fairer and inclusive society that I'm not so sure that we're really going to attract anybody to Saskatchewan, regardless of whatever the tax structure might be. And so I guess that's what I would like to see more of. And I'm so happy that members across the way are listening. I've noticed they've been a little bit distracted over the course of the afternoon, and I'm so happy that they're taking my comments to heart. It really means a lot to me. Thank you so much. And I'll maybe just go back to my earlier points about ensuring that we're making those investments in our children and in our youth, and ensuring that our Indigenous community has the same kind of opportunities in the tech space by ensuring that we're addressing literacy rates and graduation attainment rates, that there's opportunities for women to participate in the tech sector as well. All these things I think are so important to ensure that overall we can have a healthy tech sector here in the province, and one that will help us to move forward as part of a clean, green economy in the 21st century. So thank you everyone for listening. I appreciate that so much. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I move we adjourn debate on Bill 26, the Saskatchewan Technology Startup Incentive Amendment Act 2021.
The member has moved to adjourn debate. It is the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried. Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In order to facilitate the work of committee this evening, I move that this House do now adjourn.
The Government House Leader has moved to adjourn the House. It is a pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried. The House stands adjourned till 1:30 tomorrow.